Okay, welcome to your first Ed Puzzle. You are going to be learning a little bit about niche, and we've been talking about what living things are, and we talked about some biotic and abiotic factors. Now we're going to see how all those things tie together in what we call an organism's niche. An organism's niche is defined as the role that an organism plays in its environment. So it's not just whether or not it's a predator or prey. We do think about it that way sometimes, but it also includes, what does it do to find shelter? Where does it make a nest? When does it reproduce? How much sunlight does it need if it's a plant? The temperature that it needs to have. So it ties in all the biotic, so all the living things, and then all the non-living things get tied together in an organism's niche. And that includes a vast majority of the organism's survival. When we're talking about an organism's niche, we also have to make sure that we're looking at how the niche impacts it. So is it a generalist or is it a specialist? A generalist is an organism that it can sort of survive anywhere. Think of like a raccoon. And a specialist is something that is very specialized. It has to live in a certain place. It only eats certain foods, and I think of like a panda for a specialist. So the niche impacts the organism because it impacts like what they're going to eat and when they're going to mate and all of those things. So that's going to impact, how adaptable it actually is. It's also going to impact where it falls on a food chain or a food web. And a food chain and food web are the places or the connections that we see in an ecosystem of how things are eaten and what eats them. So a food chain and a food web is sort of how energy gets transferred through an ecosystem. Before we can talk about that, though, we have to talk about what types of organisms fall into those food chains and food webs. First, we have the autotroph. The autotroph is self-feeding. Think of trough as where things eat from, and auto is by itself. So an autotroph is going to get food for itself. So think of plants are autotrophs. Algae is an autotroph. They all make their own food, and they make that through the sunlight or through breaking down other chemicals. A heterotroph eats other things. Okay, it could be an insect eating plants. It could be a rabbit eating an acorn. It could be a bird eating a worm. All of those things are heterotrophs, so they eat other things. So those feeding categories are directly going to connect to what we call a food chain and a food web. It also shows that organisms are all connected to each other and their survival depends on those interactions between species. These are essential to the survival of an ecosystem, an organism's niche, and also how well that ecosystem can respond to changes. So when we're talking about an organism's niche, we're looking at, what it eats, what eats it, and the biggest other impactor is the habitat. So where does it live? What types of resources does it have access to? How does it nest? Where does it nest? How does it protect itself? All of those things are tied to the habitat of the organism. So the niche is, all the abiotic and biotic factors that affect the survival of the organism, which includes, the food that it eats and whatever eats it, but also the habitat that it lives in. The habitat that it lives in is also an essential piece of an organism's niche. Next time, we're going to talk a little bit about ecological relationships and how organisms are connected to each other through these intense ecological relationships where they rely on each other for survival. That's it. Have a great day.